This is Ghostrunner. It's a game that I hadn't even heard of up until I stumbled across it while browsing the Steam store the other day. It looked interesting to me, so I opened the page and saw that it was coming out in just 3 days. This shocked me because I had never heard anything about this game before that point, and it looked like something that could have been much bigger. After playing this game's demo, I immediately pre-ordered the game, and this isn't something I normally do. The last time I pre-ordered a game that I can remember was for Titanfall 2, which ended up being pretty good, but the reason I don't normally go for pre-orders is because of a small project that didn't exactly turn out as expected before its launch. You might have heard of it. It's a small indie project. It's called No Man's Sky. That aside, the Flying Teacup really put it best. This game really does not hold your hand at all. There's no difficulty slider, and this game is hard. You die in one shot, and one little mistake while performing parkour will lead to you plummeting to your death and having to reset to checkpoint. So this game's atmosphere and overall art style are extremely attractive. I am personally a huge fan of the whole techno-cyberpunk style, and in fact there are many aspects of this game's overall style that are not too dissimilar from Boneworks, which I have also previously reviewed. The game takes place in a post-apocalyptic future, so everything is dark and, well, cyberpunk. It's just an appealing visual style to me that I really like to see in single-player games. The style is also complemented perfectly, in my opinion, by the game's soundtrack. The game's soundtrack is one of its most important features in my opinion. It's almost, keyword almost, on the same level as the soundtrack for Doom Eternal. Now obviously it's not the same, the two games are very different and their sounds are very different, so what do I mean by this? Well, similar to Doom Eternal, each level has 1 or 2 songs dedicated to just that level, which allows the songs to be much more fitting for the specific level that they are placed in. Now, Doom and Doom Eternal soundtracks work so well with the games because the songs are dynamic and are made to change based on the flow of combat. That isn't entirely present in Ghostrunner, but there are traces of it. The soundtracks aren't quite as dynamic, but they also don't really need to be to make it work. Since this game really only has 2 kinds of paces in its gameplay, parkour and full-throttle adrenaline-fueled fast-paced combat, the argument could be made that this is also true for Doom, and it's not entirely wrong. However, generally the transitions in and out of songs in Ghostrunner aren't quite as seamless as in Doom, but since you're basically moving at full speed for the entirety of each level anyway, it's not very jarring. The difference here is that the space in between combat sections is actually a lot faster paced than Doom's non-combat sections, allowing the soundtrack to not feel out of place even outside of combat. This game's base movement mechanics feel like Titanfall, without the double jumping. I didn't want to have to compare it to Titanfall, but I almost couldn't not do that. With the game's, albeit toned down, slide hopping and wall running mechanics, it's hard to not make the comparison. Now obviously it's not exactly the same. Like I said, the slide hopping was much more toned down compared to Titanfall 2's insane speed capabilities showcased here. And Ghostrunner can stay on a wall run for much longer than in Titanfall, but it's something about the smoothness of the movement during parkour that just gives me a similar vibe to Titanfall. I've heard it compared to Mirror's Edge due to it being first-person parkour, and I could see that comparison being made from a conceptual point of view, but in practice it doesn't really feel like Mirror's Edge at all. It does have one annoying thing though, being that vaulting makes your character move way too high up and way too far forward in my opinion. It makes it hard to just get on top of a crate or a small object sometimes, and it actually led to me falling off buildings a few times. In spite of this, though, I found the parkour system being extremely fun to navigate levels with, and it is a very good pairing with the game's combat system. The combat in this game strikes a near perfect balance of being very simple and yet having a good amount of depth at the same time. What do I mean by this? Well, the attacking, blocking of projectiles, and blocking of melee attacks are all done with the attack button. There is no block button in this game. If that was all there was to it, then this would be pretty boring, but that's where the parkour comes in to save it. Included in the parkour system is a dash that also has a sensory boost ability. Essentially, when you hold down your dash button while in the air, you go into slow motion where you can make small mid-air adjustments side to side to dodge shots, evening out the playing field against the ranged enemies. As mentioned, you can block projectiles, and there's even an upgrade that allows you to deflect shots back at the shooter, which I had on for the entire playthrough as I found it very useful. Landing these deflections, however, is a rather difficult task since it basically has to be done at full speed. Most deflections in my experience are done well on the ground, so sensory boost can't be used in assisting the deflection, and the timing is rather tight. Even after playing through the game more than once, I have trouble making deflections consistently. Unfortunately, due to the difficulty of dying in one shot for the entire game with no way to upgrade your health, a lot of the combat segments turned into trial and error until I was able to make it through without dying. I think the devs knew it would be like this though, since there's no long load times after dying, which is very nice, and there's a death counter at the end of each level. This all leads to the game feeling rather arcadey, which I don't actually mind. I just almost wish they had at least added in a setting that allows more casual players to take one extra hit, or at least something. I'm going to be giving the bosses their own category, even though there are only 2 or 4 of them depending on what you consider to be a boss fight. The first one is a lot of fun since you're basically fighting another version of yourself, and you gain a new strong combat ability by beating her. The combat itself is just boiled down to fighting her repeatedly until you learn her attack patterns, and then beating her in a perfect run. Since it was a short fight and you die in one hit, any little mistake would lead to a complete reset of the fight, which basically just turned it into a game of, like I said, trial and error. The other main boss fight is the one in all the trailers, so I guess it's not technically a spoiler, it's Mara. This fight was a lot more interesting, incorporating much more environmental hazards in the form of her electrifying different segments of the arena to try and cut off your mobility, which of course kill you in one hit. Luckily, her fight actually had checkpoints due to it being much longer. The fight itself was rather basic, to be completely honest though. She just tries to hit you with her robotic tentacles until she starts doing a stab attack, at which point you can bait her into stabbing a power transformer, or whatever it is on the wall, which lets you cut that tentacle in half. After you do this 3 times, you can do a finishing blow, which was still a difficult fight, but again, once you get the patterns down, it becomes fairly trivial. Luckily, the music makes the fights a lot more enjoyable than they should be otherwise. This is the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video. This game's story is surprisingly pretty interesting. I'll try not to spoil too much, but basically it's a post-apocalyptic future and you're a former Ghostrunner. A few times there was the mention of the Great Burst, which I interpreted to mean nuclear war, especially since it's mentioned that the outside air is extremely radioactive. Oh, and by the way, the entire game takes place inside a giant megastructure that houses millions of people called Dharma. After a fight with Mara that leads to you losing your arm and getting tossed out of the window of a skyscraper, you reawaken with a repaired body and the game begins, throwing you right into the action. Immediately after waking up, you hear a voice talking to you that is only known as the Whisper. After you free the Whisper from the prison he's being held in, it's revealed that he's actually the downloaded consciousness of the Architect, the man responsible for the construction of Dharma Tower. He leads you through the game as basically the Oracle to your Batman, however, as the game progresses it becomes increasingly clear that he may not be entirely on your side. I don't want to say any more for the sake of not spoiling the entire thing, so I'm going to end this section here. So what do I think of Ghostrunner? I had a lot of fun playing it, and I would recommend picking it up or at least playing the demo if you haven't already. If you're looking for a fun standalone single-player game, this just might be exactly what you're looking for. It's definitely not perfect though. The game doesn't have the best performance, and there were a few minor problems I had with the combat and movement system, so I'm gonna have to give it a 7.5 out of 10. Thank you for watching, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next one.